They brought it out of the hay barn on a stone boat behind a tractor, and the crowd went quiet the way a crowd does when it sees a thing it cannot name. A wooden wheel, 8 feet across, black as a cold stove, with a ring of red-painted teeth around the rim like something built to chew through a mountain. It had no axle, no tire, no hub band, no iron on it anywhere. It weighed close to 700 pounds, and out of better than 200 people standing in that barnyard, not one could tell the auctioneer what he was standing next to. Harlan Voss bought it for $35, and the laughing started before he got his hand back down. It was the 11th of April, 1959, at the old Rule Kessler place, 3 miles east of Brayton, Ohio, in Loyal County. Rule Kessler had been buried in February, the last of the Kesslers, and the only family left was a nephew in Toledo who wanted a check and no more Saturdays in Ohio. So the nephew hired Colonel Ferd Stubbs to sell all of it in one long day. The tractor, the corn picker, the sows, the parlor furniture, the tools, and whatever was left in the barn from the days when a Kessler ran the iron works down on the river. Brayton in 1959 was a mill town with 1 mill, and everything else in that valley, including this auction, was small talk around it. They came for the tractor. Farm sales are like that, and Stubbs knew it, so he saved the tractor for the middle of the afternoon and worked the crowd through the small stuff while they waited. There was a dealer up from Columbus that day named Dwight Ambler, a heavy-set man in a mustard-tanned sport coat and a bolo tie who bought brass and clocks and anything with a nameplate on it, and who had a way of standing on a hay bale so he could talk over the top of the crowd. He had already bought the parlor clock, he was in a good mood, and a good mood in Dwight Ambler meant somebody was about to get their day narrated to them. Lot 141 was written on the bill sheet as wooden wheel and box of wood barn loft. 2 ringmen had been up in that loft since 8 in the morning handing things down, and to get this one out, they had to take the hay door off its hinges and lower it on a hay rope, and even then it hung up twice. It was a beautiful piece of work if you knew how to look at it, and nobody there did. The body was built up out of glued segments, layer on layer. The grain of each crossed over the last like a laminated beam, smooth as a church rail under the black paint. 6 spokes, thick as a man's forearm. The hub carried 2 round yellow-painted stubs, one on each face, sticking out like the ends of a rolling pin. And around the rim ran a ring of hardwood teeth, separate pieces, each one pegged into a socket. Each one with its flanks painted a bright signal red. Between the teeth you could see other sockets, drilled and empty, a lot of empty sockets. That whole rim was drilled like a colander, and the black paint over it was worn to the wood where 40 years of hands had gone. Stubbs did what auctioneers do with a lot they cannot explain. He made it a joke and asked for money anyway. 1 wagon wheel, he said, for the biggest wagon in the state of Ohio. The crowd laughed. A man in front said it was off a mill. Another said it was a gear out of a ferry boat. A woman said her father had one like it near Zanesville, and it had been part of a merry-go-round. Stubbs asked for $50 to start it, then $25, then $10, and got a wall of folded arms and a lot of grinning. He was down to $1. And that is when Ambler gave the crowd its verdict from the top of his hay bale. That there is 700 pounds of painted stove wood, he said, loud, pleasant, enjoying himself. You'll bust a hernia loading it, you'll bust your back unloading it, and then you'll have a wagon wheel that don't fit any wagon that was ever built. I'll give you $1 for the hay rope. Harlan Voss raised one finger and said 35. He set it into a silence, and it landed in a silence, And then the whole barnyard came apart laughing, and Ferd Stubbs took the money before Harlan could reconsider his life. A ringman wired a pale paper tag to a spoke with 35 on it in grease pencil, and Harlan Voss, who was 54 years old and had been the joke of one county or another before, took the rest of that afternoon the way you take weather. If you've made it this far into Harlan's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Loading it took him until nearly dark. He backed his flatbed against the barn ramp, laid 2 oak planks up, ran a hand winch off the front bumper, and walked that wheel up a click at a time with 2 men he paid in beer holding it off the rail. It rode home, standing up, roped to the headache rack, looking, as Ruby Voss said from the porch when he pulled in, like he had stolen the front off a church. Understand who this man was, because the rest of it does not work otherwise. Harlan Voss ran a one-saw sawmill on the creek until 1954, when the bearings and the lumber market went out from under him in the same summer, and he had made his living since with a flatbed truck, a hand winch, a chain, and an eye for material other men were paying to get rid of. He cleaned out barns and burned out stores and hauled salvage lumber anywhere anybody wanted it. And he had a standing habit, when he was deciding about a piece of wood, of rapping it once with a knuckle and listening, which looked like foolishness and was not. That habit is exactly why he bid. Harlan had walked past the wheel at 7 that morning, while the ringmen still had it hung in the hay door, and reached up and rapped it. What came back was not the flat, sour thump of weathered barn oak. It was tight and dense and high, the sound of something dry and heavy and beautifully made, and at a chipped place on the rim he saw, under the black paint, the honey color of old Honduras mahogany and crossed layers no farmer ever glued up in a shed. Harlan bid $35 because he had a porch to rebuild, a customer in Newark who paid cash for cabinet stock, and because 700 pounds of dry mahogany for $35 is a steal even if you burn half of it finding out. He did not, at the moment he raised his finger, have the first idea what he had bought. That took 2 weeks, a saw, and a man who had been gone since 1948. The Saturday after the sale, he rolled the wheel onto sawhorses in his shed, snapped a chalk line across it, and set his big crosscut saw against the rim, meaning to cut the ring off in 6 pieces and get it to clean stock in the spokes. Then he stood there with the saw against the wood, looking at the red paint on the flanks of the teeth, and did not cut. Because Harlan Voss had grown up with that paint. His father, Ward Voss, had worked 22 years as a molder at Kessler Iron Works. And on winter Saturdays he took Harlan along and set him to sweeping the pattern loft over the office, a long, low room that smelled of shellac and cedar and warm shavings, wooden shapes hanging from every rafter, all of them painted in 3 colors. Black, red, yellow, and Ward Voss explained the code once, the way he explained everything once, while Harlan swept. Black is iron, that surface comes out of the sand and stays the way it is. Red is where somebody's going to cut it, so the shop leaves extra stock there. And yellow, his father said, is a hole where nothing is. Harlan stood in his shed with his hand on a saw and understood 40 years late that he was not holding a wheel, he was holding one of the things that used to hang from those rafters. He put the saw down, threw a tarp over it, and drove into town to find somebody older than himself. He found Otto Kreider in 2 rooms over the hardware store on Water Street. Otto was 81, had poured iron at Kessler for 41 years, had hands like a bundle of pliers and one eye gone milky, and had not been asked a professional question in a very long time. He rode out to the shed without asking what it was about. When Harlan pulled the tarp off, the old man stood there the better part of a minute, saying nothing at all, and then he had to sit down on the running board. "That's not a wheel, Harlan," he said. "That's a pattern." And then he explained it, slowly, the way you explained something you have not said out loud in 30 years. You do not make anything with a pattern. You make the hole that makes the thing. You bed it in a flask of damp sand, ram it up tight, split the flask, lift the pattern out clean, and what is left in that sand is a cavity the exact shape of the wheel. Then you pour iron into it. The iron becomes the wheel, and the pattern goes back on the rack for next time. That is why the wood is laminated in crossed layers, so it never warps, never swells, never lies to you. And that is why the yellow stubs on the hub, core prints, holding a sand core that leaves the bore so the gear comes out with a hole for the shaft already in it. A hole where nothing is. And that, Otto said, is why the wheel is a hair too big. A pattern maker works to a rule that is longer than a real one, 1/8 of an inch to the foot for cast iron, because iron shrinks as it cools. Every pattern in the world is a little lie told on purpose. Kessler poured gears for half of Ohio out of that loft, Otto said. Grist mills, saw rigs, quarries, the paper works. Shop closed in 1931, and the bank took everything they could carry down the stairs. The rest went out to Rule's barn on a wagon. He looked at it a while longer. Nobody's rammed sand on that in 28 years. Then he said the thing that Harlan would repeat to himself for the rest of the summer, and it was not encouragement. It was the plain truth, said kindly. "It ain't the thing, Harlan. It's what the thing leaves behind. By itself, it's $110 of mahogany and a tool for a shop that don't exist no more." So Harlan built a rack against the dry wall of his shed, stood the wheel up on blocks with a tarp over it, and left it there. He rebuilt the porch out of other lumber. The paper tag with 35 on it he took off the spoke and left in his shirt pocket, and it went through the wash twice and survived. 2 months later, at 20 minutes to 4 in the morning on the 9th of June, the Brayton Woolen mill made a noise the whole east end of town heard in their sleep. The mill took its power from the river through a turbine in a stone wheelhouse under the north end of the building, and the turbine's head shaft carried a cast iron bull gear better than 7 feet across, 84 teeth, cast by Kessler Iron Works in 1911. That gear stepped the turbine's speed up into the main line shaft, which ran the length of the mill overhead and drove the cards. The spinning frames and the spoolers off leather belts. Everything in that building hung on that one casting, and it had been doing the work for 48 years. What the east end of town heard was a rifle shot the size of a building. The crack went through the rim between 2 teeth, ran down into the web, and forked into 2 of the arms, and Cap Lunn, who had been chief engineer there for 31 years. Got down there with a lantern at 4 in the morning and put his thumb in a gap you could see daylight through. You cannot weld that. Cast iron in that section, welded cold, cracks again beside the weld the first time it takes a full load, and Cap Lunn was too old a hand to pretend otherwise. You cannot go buy one. Either the shop that made it had been gone 28 years. And no foundry alive in 1959 would make a bull gear that size from scratch without a pattern. The pattern work alone was 2 months of a skilled man's time and more money than the gear. So Neil Brayton, 44 years old, 3rd generation, running the place on a banknote, got a quote from a machinery outfit in Cleveland to tear the whole drive out and repower the mill on electric motors, $92. 00 and 4 months. He had a contract for worsted goods that would not wait 4 months and a bank that would not wait either. On the 15th of June, he told his people the truth in the packing room. The mill had 30 days, and if the drive was not turning by then, the orders went to Rhode Island and the doors closed for good. There were 140 people on that payroll. One of them was Ruby Voss, 19 years in the spooling room, who came home that night and set the notice on the kitchen table without a word. Harlan read it twice. Then he went out to the shed with a flashlight and stood in front of his tarp. The next morning he was at the mill by 6, and by noon Cap Lunn and Neil Brayton and half the maintenance crew were standing in his shed. By that afternoon the wheel was chained to the flatbed and headed 24 miles north to Ware Brothers Foundry, where Roy Wire, 63 and pouring 1 heat a week, met them at the door with the look of a man handed a miracle he does not believe in. It took about 90 seconds to end it. Cecil Pratt, Roy's floor molder, counted the teeth on the pattern out loud while Cap Lunn read the count off the broken gear. 96 on the wheel, 84 on the mill gear. Roy Ware laid a rule across both and did not need to say the rest. Wrong pitch, wrong diameter, a bigger tooth. It was a Kessler pattern, all right. It was not the pattern for that gear. It's the wrong gear, Harlan Roy said. I'm sorry. Word got around Brayton by supper, the way that kind of word does. The mill put its notice up on the time clock wall with the last shift date typed on it. And on the Sunday, Dwight Ambler drove out to the shed on his way to another sale and stood in the doorway with his thumbs in his belt, saying the number 35 out loud in a few different tones of voice, the way a man does when he has waited 2 months for the chance. Otto Kreider heard about it on the Monday in the barber shop, third hand. And Otto asked the question that nobody in that foundry, including Harlan, including Roy Ware, including 3 men who had spent their whole working lives around iron, had thought to ask. He asked how many holes were in the rim. Then he made Harlan drive him out there, took a wooden mallet off Cecil's bench, knocked one of the red teeth sideways out of its socket, and held it up. Loose, every one of them loose, pegged in, drawn and reset by hand. Then he had them roll the wheel while he counted the empty sockets out loud, 3 concentric rings of them around that rim, drilled on different centers, hundreds of holes, worn shiny by 40 years of thumbs. Kessler Iron Works, Otto said, never had the money to keep a separate pattern for every gear it sold. A pattern for every size would have filled 2 lofts and cost more than the shop was worth. So old Emile Ruse, who ran the pattern bench and never signed a thing he made, built 1 master, 1 wheel. You set the rim segments in or take them out, and here Otto turned around and asked, in a voice going thin, what had become of the crate of loose blocks that came with the lot. They were in Harlan's shed, in the crate, under a feed sack. 2 of them had spent the spring propping the pantry window open, because Ruby had pulled them out of the kindling box in April and put them to work. The blocks were rim segments. You add them or pull them to change the diameter of the wheel. Then you step the tooth spacing around the rim with a pair of dividers and a hardwood strip. And you peg your teeth into whichever ring of sockets the layout lands on, and you plug the rest with wooden bungs and wax the joints, and that 1 wheel will lay out any large gear Kessler ever sold, anything from 60 teeth to 96. Harlan Voss had not bought a pattern for a gear. He had bought the pattern for every big gear that shop ever poured. which meant every big gear in that end of Ohio, the mill, the quarry crusher, the paper works, the 2 grist mills on the creek, the lift at the old canal basin, all of them turning, all of them one crack away from being unobtainable. Roy Ware sat down on an upturned bucket and put his hat on his knee. They had 23 days. Otto Kreider, 81 years old, worked 21 of them. He laid the 84 out himself with dividers and a strip of hickory, stepping around the rim twice to close the layout on the mark, then made them do it again while he watched. They pulled 2 rim segments and set 4 others. They pegged 84 red teeth, bunged 300-odd holes, and waxed every joint smooth, because sand finds everything. They molded it in a pit in the floor, dry sand, over 6 days, rammed, vented with wire, lifted, skinned, and torch-dried 2 days until the cavity rang. Cecil Pratt, who had begun the month with no patience for old men, spent the last week doing exactly what Otto said. The first pour was Tuesday night, the 30th of June, better than 3,000 pounds of iron out of the cupola in a bull ladle, and it went wrong in 11 seconds. The cope lifted. Iron came out at the joint and ran across the floor in a white river, and they stood up on the bench watching a summer's work turn into a puddle. Cast iron floats a mold if you do not hold it down, and they had not put enough weight on top. They had iron for 1 more heat and 15 days. And this is the part Otto Kreider had been carrying around for 28 years without knowing it was worth anything. He remembered how Kessler poured that gear. Not 1 gate, but 4, spaced around the rim, so the iron came in from 4 sides at once and met itself hot instead of chilling on the way around. A skim core in the runner. Rail iron laid across the cope and wedged to the floor, better than a ton of it. They built the mold again in 5 days. The second pour was the 5th of July, a Sunday at 9 in the evening, and there were people standing on the gravel outside that foundry who had no business there at all. Mill hands, Cap Lunn, Neil Brayton with his hat in his hands, Ruby Voss. It took under a minute. Iron went down 4 gates at once and came up level in all 4 risers, and it sat in the sand 3 days, going from white to red to black, and on Thursday morning they broke it out. It came up clean, 84 teeth, every one full and sharp. A gear better than 7 feet across that had been a wooden wheel in a hayloft in April. They trucked it to Cutler Machine in Zanesville, who bored it and cut the keyway in 2 days flat and would not take money for the second day. They hung it on the head shaft on a Saturday night with chain falls and 26 men, and at 6:40 on Monday morning the mill blew its whistle the way it had every working morning since 1888. The line shaft turned the length of that building. And 140 people went back to work with 2 days left on the mill's 30. Ruby Voss stood at her frames in the spooling room and cried, which she would not admit to for another decade. Now here is the part that makes this an iron hook story instead of a nice story about a mill. The gear was never the point. The pattern was. Inside a year, the letters came. The quarry at Newark had a crusher gear with a hairline in it. The paperworks had 2. A grist mill on the creek had been running on a cracked gear with a strap bolted over it since the war. The canal lift had been out of service since 1951 for want of 1 casting. Every one of those gears had come off the same wheel in the same loft. And there was exactly 1 thing left on this earth that could make another, and it stood on blocks under a tarp in a shed in Brayton, Ohio. Dwight Ambler came the 3rd time in October with a checkbook and started at $2,500. which was more money than Harlan Voss had made in any year of his life, and went to $4,000 before he understood he was not going to be told a price. "It ain't for sale, Dwight," Harlan said. "It's for rent." And that is what he did with it for the next 19 years. He never sold that wheel and never let it leave his hands. He built it a heated shed with a stove and a tin roof, because a pattern that gets damp is a pattern that lies, and racked it standing so it could not sag. He put Otto Kreider on a wage, real money, every week for the old man's last 4 years to teach him the layout, the segments, the shrink rule, and the code. He charged a fee for every casting that came off that wheel, went with it every time, and set the teeth himself. He repainted it that first winter, black on the body, yellow on the core prints. He mixed the red himself and got it exactly right, and when Ruby asked why the color mattered, he told her what his father had told him with a broom in his hands: red is where somebody's going to cut it. The tag went up over the shed door on a nail, a pale scrap of paper with 35 on it in grease pencil, where every man who came to hire that wheel had to walk under it on his way in. 200 people watched that thing come out of a hay barn and could not name it. A dealer priced it as stove wood. An auctioneer could not get $1 for it. And what it was the last working key to a machine shop gone since 1931. A tool that made nothing at all by itself and made everything else possible. That is the oldest kind of value there is, and the easiest to walk right past on a Saturday in April. It isn't the thing. It's what the thing leaves behind.